Horizon Education Agency is introducing the most spectacular forum of the year, Caucasus Geopolitical Forum. Under the heading of Think Big, the future of Nagorno Karabakh, we invite you all to our webinar. The Caucasus Geopolitical Forum is an initiative aimed at building up a wide understanding of what is happening in an increasingly linked environment through influential and forward-looking representatives, public officials, analysts, economists, researchers, media staff, and organizations. The forum seeks to create an open and diverse platform for discussion and the free exchange of ideas in the geopolitical environment of today, locally and globally. The theme of the event is Think Big, the future of Nagorno Karabakh, combining comprehension of geopolitics at the political and social accomplishments of the Caucasus. Horizon Education Agency seeks to create an ambitious partnership on the project of Caucasus Geopolitical Forum for the global community of 20 countries and industries to share ideas and build innovative approaches towards a more prosperous political, social, and financial future. There will be 2 panels, namely politics and social panels, and topics such as politics, history, law, psychology, sociology, and journalism will be discussed. During this symposium week, delegates, speakers, and moderators will join from Germany, UK, USA, South Africa, and Azerbaijan. The event may be hosted as a webinar should the COVID-19 restrictions still bind. We will be very happy to see you on our webinar. For more information, please apply www.hea-eu.com.
Thank you for joining us today at the Caucasus Geopolitical Forum hosted by Horizon Education Agency. Horizon Education Agency is organized this forum to engage the global community and to facilitate a discussion about political, social, and economic future of the region and its path to prosperity. We aim to bring together politicians, journalists, economists, and international experts and scholars to discuss the situation on the ground and what is the path going forward. Today's topic is the future of Nagorno Karabakh and the peace in the region. And I invite you to discuss the prospect of this long-term peace from political, economic, legal, and humanitarian standpoints. We have just completed a panel before you guys. We've had Ambassador Matthew Bryza, Mr. Contreras, and also Professor Ilhan Nuriev. And the focus there was really on the political history of the conflict. We also talked about the humanitarian aspect. We talked about multiculturalism being one of the grounds for building long-term peace in the process. And this panel is geared more towards since we have all of you, a lot of journalists kind of joining us with this one, we will go ahead and have more of a focus around media coverage and obviously the international law aspect of the conflict. So I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. Just to go through the agenda, what we're going to do is after the introductions, I will pass it over to our panelists. You will have about 15 minutes or less to provide a general comments or your insight on the recent events, as well as maybe the history of the conflict, whatever your involvement has been. And then after that, we will open the floor for question and answer session that we have prepared. So today with us is Irina Zuckerman, a New York-based human rights lawyer and a national security analyst. We also have Neil Watson, journalist and editor, focusing primarily on the South Caucasus region for over a decade. And we also have Benjamin Minnick, who is a military expert and journalist with 20 years of experience. He's also an expert in Middle Eastern policy and international affairs. So we have quite a panel. I will turn it over to Irina, to you first. If you want to go ahead and just give some comments and your insight on the conflict in general, please go ahead.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I had the pleasure of watching the first panel, and it was absolutely insightful and very thought-provoking. So I'm not going to reiterate some of the points because I do want everyone to watch the recordings of the first panel afterwards. I will instead focus on a couple of issues that have emerged as a result of that discussion. The first issue was the situation, the social situation in the media involving the Armenian diaspora primarily, and the information warfare campaign against Azerbaijan and its relative successes and failures. The other issue is the future of Nagorno Karabakh itself and how to tie in, what is the path forward to address the concerns raised as a result of this information warfare campaign in a substantive and positive, constructive way. So a brief overview of what was going on. Armenia itself has not put out a great deal of effort into formal campaigning, the way some countries may invest a great deal of financials into that. There's a great deal of lobbying in Western countries going on, but that lobbying is driven less by big firms and more by natural constituencies in these countries, especially in France and the United States, where the Armenian communities are going back over 100 years in each country, are very politically involved, very successful, integrated into societies professionally in various areas, military, political, social, cultural, whatever you can think of. They have been driving the coverage of this conflict in many ways, in part because they're so significant politically, and in part because the Azerbaijani diaspora has been relatively small, relatively young by comparison. It's worth noting, however, that in California, where the bulk of the Armenian diaspora resides, there has also been a growth in the new diaspora, people coming in, immigrating from Armenia in more recent times, and that they have been driving a lot of the more aggressive social media commentary, whereas the older diaspora has been more focused on traditional lobbying. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Ankara. They have been, they've built a lot of strong relationships in Congress and elsewhere. Obviously, members of Congress are concerned with the districts where they have a significant Armenian presence. Of course, so that's been a natural political advantage. However, it seems that that has not been enough. It has not been enough precisely for reasons pointed out by other panelists in the past, because the international law is essentially on the side of Azerbaijan in this particular conflict, because they have been attacked on Azerbaijani cities, which cannot be disputed or denied. You can dispute or discuss the extent of damage. You can discuss what weapons have been used. You can complain about the lack of media transparency, but you cannot deny the fact of attacks on civilians in Azerbaijani cities that are far away from conflict zones. And that has been a tremendous disadvantage from this information warfare perspective. So to make up for it, the media strategy has been to distract from the direct facts of the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan and to focus on side issues, allegations of third-party intervention, for instance, bringing in, attempting to paint the conflict as a religious conflict between Christians and Muslims. Also blatantly false, but most people are not familiar with the conflict and do not tend to dig far enough to discover the reality of the situation for themselves. A third issue was this issue of potential genocides of Armenians living in Nagorno Karabakh in the event that Azerbaijan succeeds in reclaiming all of those territories. Those were the three biggest points. Their aim was very emotional. It was not. It ran in contrast with the Azerbaijan strategy, which was more to focus on on the positive aspects of its own tradition of tolerance internally, as well as on its appeal as a geopolitical ally to many Western countries. So Armenia does not have the same trade or energy relationships with the outside countries. It has been pushing a human rights humanitarian angle that resonated with a lot of major Christian organizations here, but also primarily through media articles and media coverage. And the media has been quite partial in many respects to Armenians, in part because of the familiarity with the Armenian diaspora. There's been many reasons for that, but it has taken on very sinister undertones when it became increasingly obvious that information warfare goes beyond simply providing some sort of propaganda, government perspective that's sympathetic to the Armenian cause, even at the expense to truthfulness. It went beyond the usual such tactics with harassments of journalists and activists from the other side, physical attacks on the Azerbaijanis and their allies. This has happened. Most recently, there's been an incident of harassment against an Azerbaijani ambassador in Italy. So it has taken very aggressive undertones that are not there to merely paint a particular narrative, but to disrupt the efforts of the other side, to demoralize and shut down anyone who is raising critical questions, even if they're not a party to the conflict, who simply wants to understand the situation from both sides. So it has been a very aggressive campaign, intimidation campaign, and how far has it succeeded really depends. This particular aspect of the conflict took place in months leading up to the U.S. elections, which separately and apart from everything else have been very, very hotly contested, very partisan. And a lot of the media has simply not focused on external issues in general. There's been a great deal of coverage, but at the same time, it has not really had any political effect, precisely because Congress and the administration have been largely focused on internal affairs and on the election, and not so much on issues that would otherwise have been of more immediate influence to the public at large. It has not really driven any specific action in the U.S. For that reason, Armenian activists may feel like they're failing to do their part. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, it's quite obvious that Azerbaijan has been successful in retaking a lot of its territory, including strategically important territories contiguous to Iranian borders, which again raises those questions about third-party interference. And Armenians have not done a great job of denying or actually defending themselves against allegations of their own involvement with third parties. They have also not been successful in denying allegations of their own intolerance towards minorities, including other Christians, by the way. Their information warfare has been entirely offensive, with very little defensive strategy based, in fact, except for this allegation of potential genocide, which again is sort of defensive, but at the same time, it's meant to paint the other side as an aggressor. And other attacks that try to essentially stigmatize Azerbaijan as if it was a party to previous historical events and so forth. So it's not really the Armenian diaspora has not done a great job of humanizing their own side in that way, other than through disinformation. They have not actually been able to provide images of the civilians supposedly affected by the conflict, or for that matter, to provide an insight into their own lives in Nagorno Karabakh and surrounding territories. We know very little about it other than what has been destroyed and this discussion in the back and forth. Azerbaijan, by contrast, has actually focused a lot more initially in the initial stages on the defensive information warfare, focusing very much on its own positive image and very little initially on providing insights for the Western public to understand the historical, ideological concerns regarding Armenia's rhetoric about Greater Armenia, the Nazi influences in the ideological stream prevalent in the certain political classes and affecting the discourse of online activists and so forth. That's beginning to change, but slowly. And essentially, the greatest disparity has been in Armenia's success to engage the Western public and Azerbaijan's relative lack of understanding of the kind of both emotional and informational output that the Western public would be most susceptible to. Which brings us to the next point, which is what happens next. Yes, so far Azerbaijan is slowly regaining advantage on the ground. Yes, so far even the media attacks have not been able to completely tarnish its image, and especially once two major human rights organizations put forward their reports on Armenians' use of cluster munitions against civilians in Azerbaijani cities, that kind of chipped away at their own narrative. They were not able to disclaim that, they were not able to dispute that or provide any alternative explanations. At the same time, however, there is still this is not finished. The next line of attacks is going to be what happens next. The charges of future genocide have not been taken off the table, despite the fact that Armenian narrative is otherwise crumbling. Part of the reason is they're trying to tie to the tensions between with Islamists in Europe and Erdogan, and they're trying to tie Azerbaijan into this completely unrelated side issue, but which has gained a lot of sympathy, particularly in European and NATO circles. And again, some of the Christian groups, despite increasing evidence that these narratives are not true, even in the United States, have not actually taken these charges of potential or attempted genocide off their websites. They're continuing to push that narrative on behalf of the Armenians, even if these organizations are not actually themselves, strictly speaking, Armenian at all. I think this brings us to the practical discussion here. What is going to happen in Nagorno Karabakh once the war is over? Obviously, genocide itself is a red herring. It's a strawman argument aimed to arouse outrage, emotion, and concern. The reason for bringing it to the first place was to try to get the international community to intervene and to put a stop to Azerbaijan's effort before they could reclaim more territory. But that's obviously not happening and not going to happen. The United States has taken a very hands-off approach, politically speaking. They're certainly not going to intervene militarily. France's President Macron criticized Turkey, but has not taken any direct action against Azerbaijan itself. Other European countries have made comments, but have also not taken any political action, and they're not likely to interfere unless there is, in fact, overwhelming evidence of war crimes, which has thus far not been presented. But nevertheless, there's still going to be a push for this intervention and attempt to destroy Azerbaijan's image and to create this concern and to try to isolate Azerbaijan politically from Western countries by claiming that it's anti-Christian or that it's that it has some sort of an ethnic cleansing or genocidal plan. The only real way to actually dispute it, first of all, it's obvious from the facts on the ground that it's not happening. There's simply the burden is on the accusers to provide evidence of any such actions, past and present. And past history shows that there has been no such genocidal attempts in the past, so there's no reason to believe that they will happen in the future. And there's no commentary currently from any officials or the Azerbaijanis that would point in that direction. Actually, Azerbaijani commentary overall has been very restrained. The arguments online and social media have likewise been surprisingly facts-based, despite a very emotionally charged situation. But here is where the Azerbaijani strategy could use some improvement. It is to discuss the future of Karabakh in a more practicable way, along with the Western and international community. What's going to happen to people living there? And I think this is where practical solution is to engage with them. I understand that the natural inclination is to offer them money, to leave, to discuss land for peace prospects. All of these are practical solutions that are politically wise and expedient and have been done before. But in terms of information warfare, they just don't work. In terms of information warfare for Azerbaijan, the only thing that works and has worked in other somewhat similar conflicts is to show the investment that Azerbaijan is making in the region, not just economically but also socially. That it is ready to extend its hand to Armenians, both in Nagorno Karabakh, and actually its willingness to engage with the diaspora in discussions and to show its own good faith in practical ways. Now it is up to Azerbaijanis. It's up to Armenians whether to accept this outreach or not. There's been a discussion of making a transition period for Nagorno Karabakh until the party, where each party can sort of claim its presence and where Armenians can retain their access to the corridor to Armenia. I think a larger point than this corridor on Azerbaijani side is to show how it's possible to integrate people there so that they would want to live in Azerbaijan as a country and not in Armenia. I mean, essentially the argument is here, okay, you've had your narrative, you've had this emotionally charged historical connection to your country, but who is actually doing more for you? Who is actually going to show you a better life, a better future? Is your future better in Armenia? If you believe so, you will always be free to live and no one is going to stand anyway. But if you wish to feel part of Azerbaijan fully as a citizen, you will have an opportunity to do so. And it's not going to be easy because there's been decades of indoctrination. There's been some level of ethnic tensions even before that. So it's certainly not going to be an easy task, but the only way to really build up the region is to show this level of integration, is to invest resources, yes, in returning the Azerbaijani refugees. Over 1 million people have lost their homes and are excited to be back, but also to show that anyone who's willing...
Go ahead, sorry. I was just building off of your argument. Go ahead.
And to anyone who's willing to live peacefully, that offer is extended and resources will be allocated to help them live their lives as best as possible, and that their identity and cultural identity is not going to be harmed. They're not going to be culturally isolated. They're going to be living like the Armenians who live in Azerbaijan, in Baku, and who are living peacefully and with no problems. That is the vision that needs to be demonstrated, and that can put this issue to rest once and for all, and it will, because we have seen that happen before. These narratives take time to break down, but they are chipped away when the public is able to visit the region and see how people actually live, to see what rights have been extended to let's say, minority or non-primary, formerly non-primary residents of the issue, or when citizenship or other rights or autonomy is extended to people who have previously been in a state of conflict with the population that is now claiming the rule over the land. It shifts public perception tremendously, and it leaves no room for discussion on any sorts of sanctions or human rights violations or isolation. We've seen it in several conflicts around the world. We've seen the discussion of some autonomy level taking place even countries where that have been engaging in even similar efforts for decades, and essentially it becomes a non-issue. I mean, there's always going to be some level of propaganda, but it will lose its force. It will lose its potency when it becomes obvious that it's not in line with anything, and that people who live there have no reason to complain, and that there is social investment, that the region is actually becoming beneficial for everyone and for the entire region, not just for the locals who live there. As Armenians from Armenia are welcome to invest and to do business there, that there are joint ventures being planned, that there are companies from outside are being attracted to it, and they're giving jobs to both Armenians and Azerbaijanis in a non-discriminatory manner. This is the sort of substantive issue that breaks through the propaganda. Unfortunately, there comes to a point where simply saying, okay, relying on past precedent of non-genocide is not enough, simply because there's been so much effort invested into creating a very negative public image. And at that point, you have to say, look at our actions, and that's all you need. At some point, you start bringing in visitors. They get to travel for themselves. You start opening up to the media. They get to see not only the Armenian side of the story, but the side of the story of those Armenians who are being welcomed in. And Armenia cannot fight with that. They're not going to be welcoming in Azerbaijanis, especially with the current level of rhetoric. The Azerbaijanis expelled from Armenia itself are not coming back.
Thank you very much, Irina. That was a very comprehensive comprehensive insight on what's happening in parallel to the actual operations on the ground. So there's a war on the ground, and then there's also the information war. And this was very comprehensive because that's what I've seen in the past month. I would say that's probably also the case of the Azeri position that we've held for years. And you brought up some really important points that I was going to kind of address and ask, specifically the fact that the Armenian side has used these dramatic, emotional, and I would say simplistic arguments that bring in religion into the discussion, that bring in it's like the transition into the genocide conversation is almost instantaneous as soon as you start discussing it. And Azerbaijani side has been more on painting the positive image and reinforcing that positive image of the country. And I agree with you. What I've noticed in the past few months, I would say past month and a half, on Twitter and other social media, obviously there's, like you said, there are emotionally charged arguments and there's some clashing that happens there. But I have been also surprised to see that there's a legitimate desire to stay in the fact-based discussion and talk about actual historical events, political events, than to just just lash out and just have a very kind of aggressive conversation. And I do agree that we have to also recognize that the aggressive rhetoric has now surpassed just being rhetoric, and there are outright threats that are being made to public personas and just people that are on the kind of Azerbaijani side in this conflict, whether it's in the US or Europe. We have seen that has been documented, and it's very kind of alarming to see that it has really, it's not just aggressive rhetoric anymore, it's aggression. So that's very alarming, and that definitely undermines the foundation to even begin with the dialogue that you were kind of describing. And I agree with you that I think some of that has been publicly stated by the Azerbaijani president of Azerbaijan in terms of tolerance being one of our main values. And then also, it's also kind of exhibited by the fact that the country is much more multicultural than Armenia, for example. But it undermines that foundation to even come to that common place and start talking. So a lot of questions about that, a lot of questions about media. I'm very happy you touched on it, because that is what I had for this session. I will move on to the next panelist, but once we get to the Q&A session, we'll talk more about these. Okay, and I would like to pass it over to our next panelist, Neil Watson. Please go ahead. The mic is yours.
Right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this time. And I was delighted to be asked to speak about the view of a journalist. If I can just go back to my first involvement with Azerbaijan 11 years ago, it was at the outset of the foundation of a non-governmental organization promoting the business, culture and politics of Azerbaijan across Europe. And through business and culture, we were actually trying to show the connections between and relevance of Azerbaijan to Europe and vice versa. But certainly in terms of politics, we were very much focusing on Nagorno Karabakh conflict and organizing a wide range of publications, roundtables, meetings, events in the European Parliament, all kinds of things, primarily in UK, France and Belgium, to these ends. And a lot of the problems that we've been experiencing, or challenges, I should say, we've been experiencing with getting our message across, very much reiterate many of the problems that I've had over the last 11 years in trying to get our message across. So first of all, from the outset of working with Azerbaijan, I was very much aware that Azerbaijan has been very much a victim, not just now, but over the centuries, over the last 200 years or so. And it's been chipped away at. It's had a lot of injustices done to it by the Tsarist Russian Empire, by the Persian Empire, and also by the Soviet Union. And yet it's still very much regarded as being the aggressor. And that's one of the most dispiriting things about this, that Armenia is actually the country that's started causing civilian deaths, has fired on civilian positions inside Azerbaijan, far away from the so-called contact line between Azerbaijan and the Armenian occupied territories. It's used cluster bombs and Scud missiles, and yet the Western media has been almost uniformly pro-Armenian. And I think that the reason for this goes back quite a long way, and unfortunately history comes into it. The fact is that the original conflict that was fought between 1988 and 1994 was not widely reported in the former Soviet Union and also in the West. And there are many reasons behind this, but firstly we have to think back that before digital cameras and so forth and satellite phones and everything proliferated like they have now, cameras and video cameras were by their very nature very bulky. They were also very expensive. They were difficult to get around. The terrain in Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding districts is not easy to navigate. So that meant that there was the aftermath of the concepts behind the Soviet propaganda machine, even though obviously a lot of the occupation occurred immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. The approaches of the past were still very much in people's minds. So there was a general lack of coverage of the actual conflict when it happened. And it was only some brave reporters like Chingiz Abdullayev who actually went out and actually took footage, but even they only managed to get to the aftermath of things like the Khojaly genocide that occurred. They didn't actually get much footage at all of the fighting taking place. Now, in the West, trying to get our message across is also muddied by the fact that there is just still a general lack of understanding of the nature of the former Soviet republics and the degree to which they are independent to this day of Mother Russia, and particularly in relation to Azerbaijan. Most people, unless they've got some involvement in the country, they do not realize how pro-Western Azerbaijan actually is. And the fact is that it looks very much UK and to a certain extent to United States for its direction. And that's partly because of its oil wealth. Since the contract of the century was signed in 1994, it's enabled it to actually have a very independent economy and therefore foreign policy. Whereas other former Soviet republics like Turkmenistan, for example, Kazakhstan, they still have a dotted line connection to Mother Russia, even though they are formally independent countries. So, and then also, as I said before, you know, the fact is that it was very clear to me almost from the first day of working with Azerbaijan, the international law was heavily on Azerbaijan's side in this conflict. And yet in the West, people do not realize that there were 4 UN Security Council resolutions passed against Armenia, naming it as an aggressor country, saying that there need to be immediate expulsion from the occupied territories, and also the more recent European Court of Human Rights resolution that was passed against Armenia, condemning it as an occupying force. There's a general ignorance about this, And the fact that they've never actually been implemented, it's like we talk about squatters' rights in the UK, where if people live in an unguarded house for a period of time, they actually have some rights to actually live there. Because all these were passed 27 years ago, which is a lifetime, it means that to a certain extent, people regard the fact that, yes, all right, these have been passed, but they've never been implemented, therefore it's kind of all right then. So even if they know about them, the fact that there's been no implementation actually very much goes towards supporting the Armenian perspective. And as the previous speaker and numerous speakers have actually said over the last few days, there is also the concept of the religious conflict, which I put very much in inverted commas. And that is something that's very much been perpetuated by the Armenian media, but also the Armenian diaspora. And unfortunately, it has a lot of strength at the moment, because I would say that over the last few years, the whole of the Western Europe and United States has become inherently Islamophobic. And it's a very, very easy way to actually badge a conflict. You know, our conflict is quite difficult to understand. It goes back a very long way. But if you actually badge it solely in religious terms, it's very, very easy to actually identify who's the good guy and who's the bad guy in this. So there's that aspect, and also the fact that the Armenian diaspora does not actually even recognize Azerbaijanis as being a nationality in itself. It calls them Turks. And who do they regard as being responsible for the so-called events of 1915? It's Turks.
Yes.
It's not even modern day Turks, it's Ottoman Turks.
Just Turks.
Turks. And it's not even proven it's actually a genocide. In fact, Turkey has said that it will open its libraries, open its archives, so that the amount of people who died in 1915, and nobody's denied that people did die in 1915. In fact, there was a lot of dying going on in 1915 because it was the second year of the First World War. But it's still, they still regard Azerbaijanis as Turks, and to a certain extent, the occupation of Nagorno Karabakh and the atrocities that were committed between 88 and 94 has actually been some kind of payback, retribution.
Revenge, yes.
Or something of that nature to make things right again. And, you know, this is inherently wrong. And then, of course, another problem is the modern media. And I would say that we are experiencing, and it's happened in my lifetime, in my 25 years experience, is the fact that there has been a gradual erosion of professionalism by reporters across the world. And that's partly because of the way that the media actually has developed since the advent of the IT revolution. Although it's quicker to get messages across, the fact is that employing people costs a lot of money. And therefore, a lot of agencies are very short staffed in comparison to what they used to have. They're not doing the fact checking that they used to do. Even the BBC employs, on the whole, freelancers on very, very short-term contracts of 3 to 6 months. And unfortunately, you're not going to get coherent, consistent coverage with such people. Furthermore, there's the fact that the younger generation, and unfortunately I'm not part of that anymore, but they actually are solely reliant on online sources. And although we know that the Wikipedia and every page out there has got some underlying reason for existence, the fact is that they will, even if they do a consensus, they will do it extremely quickly in a couple of minutes, and they won't dig beneath the surface and actually see the reasons why people have actually put up information and have put up a page. And this is a dangerous thing, because the Armenians are extremely good at writing and rewriting history. They seem to actually employ staff around the world to jump on Wikipedia. I've tried to rewrite Wikipedia pages myself, and they get rewritten as soon as you actually put it up there, and there's no moderation going on. So that is a problem. And then, of course, there's this thing called social media, which is very, very much a double-edged sword.
Yes.
You've got multiple chances to rewrite history. Also, by its very nature, it's ephemeral. So the fact is that when people have very, very short attention spans and memories for what they've read before. So that's why it's for people to actually put posts up on Facebook, Twitter, and what have you and it may disappear, it may get submerged very quickly, but if there's enough of it going on, it gets imprinted in the public's minds and also in the minds of the media. However, I wouldn't say that it's all just because of Armenia. I think that there are some problems with Azerbaijan as well. First of all, of course, there's the fact that with the occupied territories, because they are occupied, that means that the only people who can easily gain access to them are, of course,
the occupiers. Yeah,
are going to come from Armenia, or certainly are going to be endorsed by Armenia to actually enter. And these people are not worried about a blacklisting from Azerbaijan, which is what's happened to some leading figures over the years. So that means you've immediately got embedded journalists actually in the occupied territory waiting for something to happen. Whereas in Azerbaijan, we don't have that. And unfortunately, I would say that the Azerbaijani authorities are super sensitive about actually allowing reporters to gain access to the regions that have been bombed. And that is, I appreciate the reasons why they might be doing that. They might be thinking that actually it's better for the country to actually have the news carefully controlled. But actually, I personally think it's better for the people to have a chance to see what's happening on the ground, be it good or be it bad, because it makes them realize the kind of aggressor that they're actually dealing with. And also the difference between that aggressor and actually the way that Azerbaijan is defending itself, which is doing its darndest to actually use the latest technology to focus its firepower on actual Armenian forces rather than Armenian civilians. There is a problem also, as the previous speaker alluded to, and has been repeatedly said, that many reporters and media heads are of Armenian heritage. I don't believe this is very much of a problem in the UK. The Armenian diaspora is not very big here, and it's not very powerful. But certainly United States and California particularly, but also in France. And France is, as we all know, is a major problem at the moment for the whole of the Islamic world. I think that they are deliberately trying to obviously block Facebook pages. They are trying to stop Azerbaijan generally from getting its message across. And they are helping badge this in the religious terms because many of their forebears came to United States or France in the aftermath of the events of 1915, whatever those may have been. So, and of course, I would say that the connection with Turkey is very much a double-edged sword. I mean, the fact is that in the original conflict of 1988 to 94, Turkey, my understanding, was not particularly helpful to Azerbaijan, other than closing its border. But, and that has a significant effect, of course, on Armenian economy development over the last 25 to 30 years. But this time, Turkey has come very heavily down on the side of Azerbaijan, and it does need to have that support. And in fact, the fact that Azerbaijan's two main allies in the conflict are Turkey and Israel actually shows very much its multicultural, multi-religious stance.
Yes.
But unfortunately, Turkey is also one of the big bad wolves in the West. It's been regarded as being increasingly religious. I think this is undeniably true. And it does make it very easy for the media in the West to actually make up these connections with ISIS, Pakistan, and this ridiculous story of the Syrian mercenaries, and also making some kind of connection with modern terrorism that we're experiencing in the West that's been fueled by Islamophobia. So I think that that is an issue. And of course, the fact is that although the problem is that, Armenia itself committed a great many terrorist atrocities in the 70s and 80s, but those seem to have been forgotten and rather pushed under the carpet, probably because of the strength of the Armenian diaspora and the Armenian-led media, but also because they actually occurred before the internet revolution taking place. And we come back to the concept of social media again. As I say, very much a double-edged sword, but it has the potential to enfranchise everyone to become some kind of journalist. I was asked the other day, do I think there's going to be room for a journalist in 10 years' time? I think the fact is that there always will be room for professional journalists, but the fact is that all kinds of social media and all posting on social media it all is the finance for that is very, very much muddied. In the UK, we've got some very long established newspapers, print newspapers, most of which go back over 100 years. We know which is Conservatives, we know which is Labour, we know which is Communist, we know exactly where they're coming from. The problem with social media, because it overlaps into entertainment and infotainment and that kind of thing, the actual aegis behind it is often very, very clouded. And that means that the political overtones of that become very, very clouded. And of course, that also provides scope for misinformation. And I hate to quote Donald Trump, but the fake news. It means it's fake news is very, very easy to get out there in a way that ever was before. The thing is that with the internet age, even though it's now easier than ever before to get messages across, Azerbaijan has experienced incredible problems in actually getting its rightful, legal, lawful message across to the West. And I think that the way forward for this is that Azerbaijan does need to make itself more open to foreign journalists. It has far, far more to gain by inviting journalists from both traditional and non-traditional, that's online media, bloggers and so forth, allowing them to become familiar, even embedded in Azerbaijan, than it has to lose. Azerbaijan is a relatively young country in its modern independent form. We know it has some challenges internally, but the fact is that there's one thing that all Azerbaijanis agree about, regardless of their political affiliation, and that is over Nagorno Karabakh. And I think that you have a lot more to gain by allowing free access for all journalists without moderation to come to your country and to actually report on all the events in the country, and particularly in relation to this war, completely unhindered. It can only be good for you. And we come to the final point. Actually, I've not elaborated too much on what will happen after the conflict, but the fact is that after the conflict finishes, Azerbaijan the war is not over. Azerbaijan may, and I sincerely hope, will win the actual violent war, the hot war, but it's then got to justify its position in the eyes of the international community. And it is losing the information war. So it needs to actually this needs to be explained in great detail to the European media, and they only do this by personal experience and also by a highly integrated program of political lobbying, conferences, roundtables, inviting journalists from all sides of the equation to actually come along, to listen, to ask questions, even to be hostile. But when people are hostile, they often land themselves in hot water. And Azerbaijan has always got an answer to an Armenian-based journalist or a hostile journalist or an Islamophobic journalist. So I think that there's a great deal of work to actually do in getting Azerbaijan's rightful message across once this conflict is finished. Those are my comments at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Very insightful comments. I'm so happy that the entire question list that I have here, you have touched on almost all of the items I have here. I have also, that was one of the observations that I've had in the past few months, the paradox of how difficult it has been, how it has been such an uphill battle here in the US to educate general public on what is going on, because the strategy that Irina spoke of and that you spoke of on the Armenian side has been very dramatic emotional statements that are conveniently linked to religion, to Islamophobia. What you mentioned, I have lived in the US for 17 years now, and I have seen that connection between Azerbaijanis and Turks and the blurred line and this weird connection to the genocide. And that kind of brings you back to this whole revenge mentality, revenge emotion that Armenians have made so public and that feel so passionate about it. And it's so easy to get lost in a seemingly a very simple, I wouldn't call it simple, I understand all conflicts are complex, but at least recognizing what actually happened on the ground in the first war and what is happening on the ground today. It has been such an uphill battle, and it was an eye-opening moment to me that it is true, the emotional arguments that have prevailed on the Armenian side will win. They will grab attention. They will grab attention in such a way that the support is immediate, because when you hear, people are dying, you're ready to do whatever is needed to stop it, to put in, to participate somehow. And we've had, in the first war, there was barely any presence of Azerbaijanis here in the US. And you talked about the other limitations and challenges of journalism at the time. The situation is very different now. There is presence. It's not anywhere close to the Armenian presence, but it's there and it's pretty active. And what I've seen in the past month, I don't think I ever thought that could be possible. I mean, we've had, you're talking about social media. There has been so many calls, vague calls to support Armenia, so many vague calls to stop violence, even though it's very clear if you look at the facts where the violence originates. And then what we've also seen is taking back some of these public support statements from popular, singers and Instagram personas, and a lot of these things are happening in the social media these days. So a lot of these statements are coming from pop stars and celebrities, and what we've seen is that pressure works. There are several cases in which those statements were taken back and an apology was issued. So that was heartwarming, and that made me hopeful that grassroots advocacy, informing, doing your absolute least, what you can do as a citizen to inform the general public, will have effects, even if they're not immediate. A lot of questions, and like I said, a lot of very important topics that you identified, that to me are big challenges in this way towards eventual peace building once the actual war is over, and we're going to be in this outside in the media, in the international media. Obviously we will be dealing with a lot of labeling and a lot of these continued and maybe even more intense emotional arguments and messages by the agenda. And then you'll have people on the ground that will have to coexist somehow and overcome those challenges. And these things make that foundation for that dialogue much more difficult. I will go ahead and pass on the mic to our third panelist. Benjamin, thank you for being patient. Please go ahead. This is your chance to give general comments on the conflict as a journalist that has covered it, the journalist that has been very active on social media and outside, and then we will proceed to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today. We just finished an 1,800-mile road trip last night, and I woke straight away this morning to join you.
I appreciate it.
Not a problem. I want to thank Irina and Neil. I'm a big fan, Neil, and I work with Irina on a daily basis. So this is amazing. And I don't want to cover too much that's already been talked about, but there are a couple of things from a military aspect that we need to look at. And it ties into how journalists are able to cover the conflict. And the reality of it is, Armenia plays what I call a mirror game. The worst things that they can think of and the worst things that they do during a conflict, they mirror it on Azerbaijan. So the call goes out that a city's been attacked and it's cluster munitions. And, everybody's looking in Armenia to figure out where these cluster munitions have been used on civilians. And instead it's in Ganja in Azerbaijan. And when you ask questions about it, like I have very openly, as you stated, you ask about it and they say, well, we didn't do that. Well, I'm relatively certain that the Azerbaijani people did not fire cluster munitions at their own cities. I am new to this conflict, so I haven't been covering it like Neil has, but I do understand it. And I got involved back in August when I was in a panel with the Armenian ambassador, and that was here in the United States. And about 2 questions into the panel, I realized that it was rigged. So through some shenanigans of my own, and Irina can attest to this, I made the ambassador answer my questions through Irina truthfully. And when that was done, he was sweating and rigid and almost at the point of tears, because he knew that I had publicly made him admit to lying. That's when my problems with the Armenians started. See, I live in California, so it's nothing for them to reach out and find me, which they have. But I realized it's a campaign of pressure, and it's them being bullies. They're like the schoolyard bully. They're going to push you around and push you around and push you around, and until you stand up for yourself, they're just going to keep doing it. And that's what I've done. I've started fighting back. I'm not going to be politically correct. I'm not going to be nice. I speak, if you've read anything of mine, I speak my mind. I have a sharp tongue, and I think that is going to be the best way to influence the Western media. There is this feeling that I get when I talk to other journalists, and I really, really appreciated the way Neil brought this up. There's journalists in the traditional sense, and I would consider, that to be somebody that has studied the craft and been published both online and in print, and understands the journalistic process. And there's people that have blogs, and I'm kind of a cross between the two. I mean, I've been in the New York Times, I've been in the Jerusalem Post, and I operate several blogs. But the thing is, we fact check everything. Everything that we put up gets fact checked, and I don't mean by 1 or 2 people. We have a series of people that fact check all the information that we use and that we report on, and that we put out for public consumption. And I think that's something that is lost in the tech craze of new journalism. Like Neil said, you don't have that, and the US is falling victim to that now. A retraction or an apology used to be, something that happened once in a great while. Now it seems to happen 2 or 3 times a day. And he was talking about how you knew in the UK which outlets were conservative, which ones were communist, which ones were labor. It was the same way here in the United States. But now, instead of knowing that, you have to add to the fact of, well, how often do they have to go back and retract their stories and write new ones because they had the information all wrong? So it's no longer a concept of telling the truth or getting the story out. It's they want to be the first to get it, and they're willing to put whatever information down in an article and press it out. So that's the first problem here in the US. The second one is, in fact, the religious concept of how Armenia does this. However, I want to point something out. I've done quite a bit of research myself into this, and I asked my wife to help because this is her area of anthropology. So they talk about the religious aspect, and they talk about Christianity, and they make all of these claims, but I feel like nobody fact checks the claims that they're making. Nobody fact checks them. And if you go back and look at them, you realize that 7/8 of them are complete rubbish. It's just garbage. Somebody created a map that they claim is, 1600, 2000 years old, and there's no other record of it. You know, there's areas that they lay claim to and they press for that don't even exist. And you have city councils here in California, as if a city council really matters in this aspect. You know, they're voting to recognize that area in existence. I won't even speak it out loud because it's just insane. It's teaching the world that you can imagine something, and if you convince enough people to imagine that something with you, then it'll come into existence. And that's a problem. You know, that's a problem if you remove the concept of armed conflict from this. Now you enter into armed conflict and people are being killed, and this information is fueling support for that on one side or another. That's extremely dangerous.
Yes, we talked about that in the first panel, and the panelists kind of referred to it as the red line. And that's one of the arguments that I was trying to make is Ambassador Bryza was talking about the romanticized aspirations of Armenia or
Absolutely.
any country, right, based on historical, or I would call it historical agenda, because as you mentioned, you need to, you know, history cannot be invented, right? So if we're talking about those arguments, this is not a, you know, a rigorous research-based finding, and it happens in many different countries, in many different nations, where you may have some knowledge, some basic knowledge about a certain region that used to be part of your country, or
Right.
and then you cross that red line, right? When does it stop being a conversation that you're having in a tea house with your friends, wherever it begins and that's where it ends? Or when does it come to your political agenda, where it actually, in a matter of many years, then places you in the middle of a military conflict where people are dying over something that is unsupported, and has become the official, you know, policy of a country. So that red line is incredibly important. And I would argue that, you know, putting everything aside, without respect for borders, without knowing that those conversations and those discussions cannot be elevated to the level of official policy of a country, of a government, you cannot really have a sustained peace anywhere. I mean, it's not
Absolutely
specific to
not.
South Caucasus, right? If we start talking about, if you just look at the world and you look at the maps and the way they have changed throughout the years, it never happens peacefully, right? And you may have situations where a whole country was part of the Roman Empire. That doesn't mean that Italy needs to become an expansionist and start occupying those. You know, it's a very, to me, that is such an important argument, that you are entering a dangerous turf when you begin those conversations. And in that sense, Armenia is, to me, is an outlier, because they have taken it to the extreme. They have taken it to the point where it has been elevated as an official policy of a government, and it has led to war. It has led to people dying, civilians and military, obviously. So I agree with what you're saying. And it's important to kind of also take a look at some of that historical research, and we've done that throughout the years. And yeah, you just dig a little bit, and you find that 90% is kind of emotions. There's some history there. There's some information, obviously subjective, and there hasn't really been, you know, you can think of it from that perspective. There hasn't really been an objective platform or forum where historians can talk about these things, right? It has remained at this emotional level without anyone actually talking to each other, even though both sides have, you know, their own. The Azerbaijanis also researched history and Armenians researched history, but no one's really talking to each other because, well, we skipped that space, you know, that stage. We are basically at war now because of these moods that are now official policy of a government. So I apologize for cutting you, but that was something that came up in the previous panel as well, and I think it's important to highlight. Please go ahead,
absolutely.
continue.
Absolutely, I really appreciate that, because there's not a lot of people that can tie that aspect into military matters and warfare. That's where I come in. So we have to consider some other things that aren't talked about. So let's get into the difficult things that aren't talked about, because there
Just
are
in
a
the
lot
matter, just in the interest of time, I apologize for cutting you off. I'm just asking the administrator to give me a time check just to let us know how much time we have. But Benjamin, please go ahead. They will write it in the chat.
So if you think about it, it won't take long to figure this out, and it completely breaks down the entire conflict. Just think about this, and you can remove the entire conflict. Everybody talks about 1915 and what happened there, and that was horrible. But like Neil said, the entire world was dying at that point in time because it was World War I. If you go back even farther to, if I remember correctly, 1855 to 1905, there were other conflicts. There were other conflicts between Armenia and Turkey, and the same thing played out then. In fact, when that war ended, Turkey had beaten Armenia up so badly that in the peace signing process, they said, we're not even going to ask for any kind of reparations from you. Just don't do this again. And it's the same thing. They're going to start a fight. They're going to broaden it out. They're going to draw all kinds of international support from it, monetary support, everything they can get. And then they're just going to give up. And in 20 years, they'll start again. This needs to happen. An end needs to be discussed and implemented. All of the UN work that's been put into Azerbaijan needs to be enforced, and people need to live in peace. It's not necessarily going to be a war on the ground, because most people don't realize it, but these people have lived in Nagorno Karabakh for years, and they only fight when the government wants to fight, when the Armenian government wants to fight. They only fight then. Other than that, these people live side by side, hand in hand all the time. I've talked to both sides. I've been lucky enough to talk to both sides, and they live their lives every day the same way, except for when there's a war. So going forward with this area, more attention needs to be poured into building infrastructure and finding ways that the displaced people on both sides are going to have places to live, where people are going to be able to reclaim buildings and properties that were taken from them and their families 30 years prior, when they can officially go home and they won't be displaced any longer. But that's going to start with some hard truths, and I don't think that they're ready for that. The rest of the world should be, but I don't think that they're ready for that on either side, to be real honest with you.
I agree with you, and thank you for your comments. I will open the Q&A session, and there's so many interesting things that you guys are all touched on in terms of the media coverage, in terms of what actually happens on the ground. And Benjamin, you talked about sort of the difficult truth that both sides will have to face, so that we can lay the sort of the grounding work for a future dialogue. One observation and a question to all of you, for me, as the sort of a citizen that has been following all the news, is I think Irina alluded to it in the beginning, that the Azerbaijani side, I would say in the past 2 months, and even before that, has always held the agenda of kind of addressing the conflict from the point of view of international law. And I understand that instinct, because even when I would think about it, it seemed so appalling that such basic international laws were ignored, and it has been so difficult to inform the public before you even, start talking about the conflict, that let's just get this straight, that we all agree that these lands are recognized by all of these countries in the world as territory of Azerbaijan. But what I've noticed is that emotional arguments will prevail, emotional arguments tied to these simple connections to things like Islamophobia, simple connections to the calling to protect Christianity, to prevent a genocide. I mean, we're talking big emotional statements. But if I look at, if I step away from that international law agenda that we have tried to use when we're discussing the conflict, there has been a huge humanitarian crisis in Azerbaijan as a result of the war. I mean, think of it. This is the most difficult period for a newly emerged country. It ends up with 1 million refugees, internally displaced people, and these are to us, even throughout the years. I mean, we've seen them. We've seen the influx of people without houses, without any certainty about their future, kind of coming into Baku and other cities and trying to build their life. But I don't even think we realize how difficult that is. And so the humanitarian crisis in the first war has been, I would say, even much more kind of imbalanced towards Azerbaijan, in the sense that we had a huge number of people that lives were just, completely turned upside down. The vulnerability of being a refugee, the living below the poverty line, the illnesses that they had to deal with because of the kind of conditions that they had to live in. So my question is, and then tying it to the recent events, right? We have more than 90 civilians that were bombed with cluster munitions by the Armenian side in this conflict. These are cities completely away from the conflict zone. Yet, I'm turning to you, and the question is, what do you suggest? How do you think we can increase a more objective coverage of this in the US and around the world to, I would say, counter and also present the story of humanitarian crisis in Azerbaijan to the world, to the global community? My question is to all of you, but I wanted to hear from Irina specifically on how, what are the more effective ways to address that, to raise that to the agenda?
Well, first, Ben and I, that's exactly what we've been working on. We've been featuring articles looking not just into the immediacy of the conflict, but into the history, to exposing different aspects of what was going on, not only just to counter disinformation and talking points from the Armenian side, but also to lend a deeper understanding of the underlying issues that will need to be addressed in order for the conflict to be resolved on all levels, but also for the world to understand that this is not a simple issue. This is not simply just a territorial claim, because territorial claims can be resolved in ways other than wars. We have seen countries resolve them through litigation and through diplomacy. There's no reason for them to necessarily launch attacks in order to resolve a territorial dispute. So whenever you see something like that escalate, you know that there are other issues besides the actual legal international process. You know that there's some other agenda that cannot be met through diplomacy, or that at least one of the sides does not wish to meet through diplomacy. And that's what we've been trying to get at. Now, what can Azerbaijan itself do besides us? First of all, honestly, Armenia essentially out resources Azerbaijan by far. It spends hundreds of thousands of dollars on media coverage every week through diaspora, but also through lobbies and also through sympathetic third parties. They've been aggressively reaching out to Christian organizations, to politicians, to others. They've been building relationships in Congress. They've been having these they've been investing into this dispute for decades before this current set of events, and that cannot be easily undone. We can start building these bridges now, but it's not going to take a day or two, considering the level of investment Armenia has already, and its lobbies and its diasporas have already made. So right now there's a lot of catching up to do in the sense of establishing formalized engagement process in building relationships, in having conversations. Second issue, Armenia is far more engaged with the West, with Westerners directly on this issue. Armenians, because of so many of them are integrated into the US and France, they're having these conversations with in many social and cultural and media circles. The Azerbaijani diasporas are relatively small, so Azerbaijan has to kind of figure out a strategy to engage with more Westerners, and not just among themselves and with Armenians, whether on social media. Neil referred to conferences, roundtables, and so forth. I think that's a very effective method of engagement, even through webinars, but it's got to be substantive. It has to be engaged with the Westerners. It has to be perceived as a conversation and education effort, and certainly not as propaganda or PR. That's not going to work, because Armenia already has an upper hand in it, and anything that simulates the same style is just not going to be effective. It's got to be substantive, long-term. It's not going to be easy, but the more these issues are confronted in a way that's not perceived as agenda-driven, but informative, and the more people are likely to understand. Even going back to the 1915 issue, whether or not it was genocide at all, and so forth, the reality is the set of events was very complex. Over 1 million people who were killed included women, children, people who should not have been killed, no matter what the cause. But at the same time, you cannot disregard that did not occur out of thin air. There was also a political conflict between Armenian leadership and the Ottomans at the time, and there were other communities affected, not just Armenians. There were Greeks and so forth, and there were also other issues going on between different communities, between Kurds and other ethnic groups residing in the area. There were simply other smaller ethnic conflicts going on simultaneously that do not receive coverage, and without understanding the full story of those interactions in that region at the time, you cannot understand what really happened. And I would urge anyone who wants to counter these false narratives of tying Azerbaijanis to those events to engage in historical discussions of how Azerbaijan emerged as a country, who the history, just discussing the history and engaging in research. I understand that not all of the countries involved in those events have been open to releasing their archives, but to the degree it's possible, that type of scholarship should be encouraged and publicized in a wide way, not just through scholarly research, but through popular outreach and political outreach as well. I found it effective that work, I integrate bits and pieces of history into my political and geopolitical analysis, because it gives a sense of context to what I'm talking about, and people can reference it. They can go back and learn more if they wish, and they understand that it's not coming out of thin air.
I agree with you. I think that the circumstances were very complex, and there's no way to really discuss that historical event of 1915 without providing the full context and walking through all of those actual things that happened on the ground and what was happening in the world. But I wanted to know, in terms of Nagorno Karabakh conflict, do you agree that connecting these two ends up more problematic than
absolutely.
Trying to explain? So maybe, I mean, my reaction has always been, we can talk about this, we can talk about that, but when you merge the two, it just makes a difficult process even more difficult.
I mean, honestly, a lot of this has been simple racism, conflating related but different communities, as if they're one country with one historical past. It works for people who are inclined to engage in stereotypes and ethnic
generalize and summarize.
It's inaccurate, and that's why I underscore that the history of Azerbaijan itself and its communities should be separately and independently explored and exposed to the public, because this sort of argument works on people who don't know anything. And for them, it is, oh, well, these people are related, so therefore it's very likely that they were part of the same problem back in the day. But if you see that they followed a completely different war pattern, in fact, that Azerbaijanis were never part of the Ottoman Empire to begin with, that becomes a much more difficult argument to make. I mean, of course, it's going to take time, and educating the general public is not the same as educating scholars or even politicians, but nevertheless, that's something that requires investment if it's ever to work, if that perception is ever to break through. If you want to avoid having emotional falsifications define the narrative for you, then you have to engage in providing an affirmative, informed narrative, counter narrative, based in facts, that creates this bulwark that inoculates the public against disinformation.
Yes, and I agree that having roundtable discussions, webinars, and approaching it from the perspective of more or less objectivity, providing information, that's really effective when it comes to defining the opinions of the general public. And I hope we'll see more of events like we are having today. Anyone else from our panelists would like to offer their comments on this question?
I'd like to. Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Please, go ahead.
Go ahead, Neil.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, sorry about that, but I think it's just so important to make it clear that there's a distinction between refugees and internally displaced persons. And it's a confusion that I'm finding all the time. And the fact is that Azerbaijan, 1/10 of the population are IDPs, internally displaced persons. That means that Azerbaijan is actually fighting this war on its own territory. And this is something that's not widely understood. Even some Azerbaijanis do not get this right.
Yes.
I think that if the world became aware of this fact, then it would actually prove more than anything that Azerbaijan is actually in the right in this conflict. It's undeniable. And then, of course, there's been the question over the years: how do we care for these IDPs? I've seen footage over the years of the way they lived in railway carriages. They lived in disused factories, schools. There was even one film I was involved in making at one point, which showed an old lady who literally lived in a hole in the ground for 25 years. And the question has always been for the Azerbaijani government: to what extent do we actually provide some basic housing for these people, so they don't die of cold in the middle of winter, so they don't die of hypothermia? And of course, they have gone some way towards actually making some very basic little houses, but not so they're settled so much that when they get the territories back, they either don't want to go back home again because the second generation's only ever known that. So they've managed to get it right now. But the fact is that this fact of displacement and the fact that even now Azerbaijan is fighting this war on its own territory needs to be very much put across, I think.
Thank you. Very good point. And I do agree with you. Even if I think back to my childhood and when the influx of internally displaced persons started, I think you're right. I think we didn't fully understand what that means. But now, having read so many articles and watched documentaries and films, articles about the conditions in which they live, and, also thinking about a young country, right, Azerbaijan, having to deal with a 1 million population of IDPs and being able to provide some basic support for them to set up their lives, not mentioning the psychological impact, the healing that needs to happen for the pretty much a generation. I read some of the quotes from IDPs from a report that was put together by the Brookings Foundation, and it was Brookings Institute, and it was really heartbreaking. One of the quotes, one of the ladies said that, you know, life goes by and we keep waiting for something to happen, but I don't have much faith that I will be able to see that day when I go back and I actually go back and see whatever's left of my hometown. And one thing that has been very difficult to watch is, now that we have footage from the areas, and I'm specifically talking about the adjacent regions, is how in the state that they're in. I mean, it's completely scorched and razed to the ground, and places that people used to call home are now non-existent. They're look like deserted, and you can tell no one has been there for 30 years. So that's a tragedy, in my opinion, that it adds more pain to the fates and lives of 1 million people whose lives were completely turned upside down as a result of the first war. So I completely agree with you that in addition to fighting the war on its own land, we have had now a 30-year period where we had to deal with this huge problem of how do you accommodate such a 10% of your population, especially every 10th person in Azerbaijan is internally displaced.
Absolutely. In a place like Azerbaijan, where everybody's very closely related to each other, that means that nobody is far removed from being a displaced person themselves.
Yes.
Even if they're not living as a displaced person in a camp, even in the center of Baku, you will bump into people who are displaced. I've done it myself. So it's, you know, it's affecting the entire population. Plus, it's been an enormous financial cost for the country.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that happened at a very difficult,
yes,
you know, stage of our history. So that also added one of the problems that Azerbaijan had to deal with in a very difficult period in its history. One of the questions that we have received from the audience is probably more towards international law aspect. What happens if Nagorno Karabakh is actually recognized by one of the countries, a country in the world? What happens from international law perspective? So, opening up the floor if any of the panelists would like to take this.
That's Irina's area of expertise, but I do want to weigh in on that. And I feel it pertinent to bring it up and tie it into the last question as well. So in the event that the resolutions are enforced, there is a thought process that happens with all displaced individuals. And when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not attacking them and I'm not trying to dishearten them, quite the contrary. There is this feeling that they're going to go back to where they came from and resume their normal lives as if nothing has happened. So this is where the international community is going to have to step in and actually do something about the internally displaced people, because like you said, they're going back to ghost towns. They're not going back to functioning cities and towns. You know, looking at the reasons for why this conflict has ensued and why the occupying force doesn't want to leave. It ties in natural resources and income, and you know, to put it mildly, when the international law is enforced, it's gonna require international assistance from all over the place to be able to make this work, to make it viable, to make it functional. And it's going to start with a massive cleanup effort. I mean, war, you know, once a battle is over, you know, it doesn't go away. I mean, you know, look at France after World War II. There's still munitions and damages, you know, 100 years later almost. And that's going to have to be at the forefront of everybody's mind going forward in Nagorno Karabakh.
to add to what Ben was saying, actually, yes, we should be looking at it not just as a simple legal matter, but a matter of investment, a matter of development, a matter of infrastructure building, but also an opportunity. I had 2 years ago when I was in Azerbaijan, I had an opportunity to visit a liberated area of Georgia Majanli. The government has done a great effort in creating this new space for the population and encouraging people to move in and to reside there. The problem is, even though it was liberated and under Azerbaijani control, it was still under attack from the Armenian forces. So any such any reclamation of the lands and enforcement of international law would also require withdrawal of Armenian forces completely from those territories, and there can no longer be any discussions about them being there just in case of what? I mean, there's got to be a focus on political enforcement of border issues just as much as simple termination of conflict. We also have to understand that many of the ATPs who have lived in Azerbaijan for all this time, they have not had an opportunity to, they've adjusted to their new lives, and returning home to their previously held homes, they may not have anything left. So it's going to take time. It's not going to be an immediate process. It's going to take time to rebuild, to reconstruct, and to create a new future. It should not be seen as a mere return to some nostalgic paradise. It should be seen as a new opportunity. It should be attracting investors as a new opportunity and not merely a response to a humanitarian crisis, which it undoubtedly is, but it's more than a humanitarian crisis. It's an opportunity for Azerbaijan to reinvent itself, to step away from the image of a country embroiled in a long-term war, and to invest into a future that is modern, that is based in positive solutions, in constructive buildings.
I apologize. I'm asking the other panelists to please put their mics on mute if you don't mind. We're getting some noise in the background.
So 1 second. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize.
Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah. So there's been so we should be looking at it not just as a response to the past, a response to this international law issue, but as an affirmative position of Azerbaijan trying to invest into its country. It's been trying to diversify away from dependence on oil, but this is one way to do that. It's one way to create a space, maybe a smart city could be located in that area, a digital hub of some sort, an area for joint ventures in agriculture and other projects with other countries, an active engagement with the international community that's not just about humanitarian aid and asking for assistance, but also something that gives them a sense of why they should be investing in it. Something that essentially makes them a partner in the rebuilding in the future, and something that makes them want to enforce the international law, and not just because somebody somewhere decided it's the right thing to do. Now they have an active role to play. Now there's a self-interest in enforcement rather than a passive attitude. And if you want the international community to be with you fully and not just in word, then they have to see, they need to be given a reason of why they should be doing it, other than out of compassion or because there's been a document that affirms something. They need to be held responsible, not just to complaints and that sense of general social accountability, but by being engaged and by being part of something greater and better and constructive and positive. That's my view of the situation.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to go ahead to our last question. We have talked about a lot of important aspects of the the conflict and the media aspect of it. You all know that the Armenian diaspora has played a very big role in how this conflict is perceived in the United States, from general public, from elected officials, all the way to the White House. So, and Irina, you mentioned also that we are, if you look at the Azerbaijani side, they're clear outsourcing in that sense. They definitely are more, they have more sources to dedicate to it, financial, actual constituents that can influence the votes in the Congress and etc. I wanted to open up the floor to maybe each one of you to say what can be done in this situation. What's an effective way to maybe curb some of that, recognizing that we don't have the exact same resources and we haven't been doing it as long as the Armenian lobby has done it. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists to provide a short answer to this, and then we'll start wrapping things up.
I agree that trying to outmatch just by spending more money does not necessarily work. And quite frankly, I've been looking at Azerbaijani formal lobbying efforts in the US, and quite simply, it's not just about resources, but a lack of strategy. You cannot depend on only one source of information or community. A lot of the strategy by Azerbaijan up until this point has been heavily dependent on its good relationship with Israel, which of course should certainly be part of the conversation, but to some extent it's another disadvantage. It creates a dependency, it creates a one-sided perception, and unfortunately it fuels conspiracy theories rather than solves any issues. Israel cannot solve these issues in the US for Azerbaijan. It can certainly provide its own perspective, but the strategy should be grounded in the US interests and diversifying of communal outreach to different organizations, to evangelical communities, to potential investors, business communities, to humanitarian groups, to the media, to political and analytical circles, to professional groups that may have an interest in professional collaboration with growing Azerbaijani sectors, different economic sectors, artisans, preservation of traditional artisanship, museums.
So a very comprehensive approach that includes many different aspects: business, religion.
So you can do something with not necessarily trying to outmatch financially, but smarter, in a way that creates a sense of real relationships and a stronger bond with the country and with the target communities, instead of just propaganda and talking points, which has been the Armenian approach. It has been effective through sheer volume and overwhelming, but if you start to actually invest into doing it the real way, into creating those bonds, people will easily see the difference.
Okay, thank you, Irina. Neil, turning on to you, you talked about the fact that, in the United States and maybe somewhat in European countries, in France specifically, you simply have a lot of journalists that have Armenian heritage. And so how do you address that? Is there any advice or some effective strategy that could help us respond to that?
Well, I think that the problem is that the Armenians are very good at boiling down this very complex and historic conflict into very simple terms, which is religion. Yes. And I think that we can do the same thing because the supporters of Armenia are the two big bad wolves of the world. They are Russia and Iran. And if we manage to put the fact across that this is a war by proxy, and that Russia and Iran have been supplying arms to Armenia for a very, very long time, then I think that it makes it very obvious to the world that Azerbaijan is right in this particular context. And then, of course, we do need to be doing more consistent. I very much support what Irina's saying here. We need to be doing a lot more political lobbying and having a lot more open events that are actually promoting the truth about this conflict, which are open to all sectors of the media and public as a whole to actually understand Azerbaijan's quite correct approach on this subject. I'm sorry, you've gone rather quiet.
I was on mute. I apologize. Thank you for the insightful comments. These are very good, and I do agree that when you're outnumbered, sometimes being smart about it and being very targeted and comprehensive will yield very good results, even if you may not have the same resources as the Armenian diaspora in this case.